Hey everybody, Charles for HumbleMechanic.com. Today we're going to be learning how to replace a vacuum pump on a 2.5 liter engine without removing the transmission. So officially this is not a by-the-book repair, so I want you to make sure before you do this that you watch the entire video to have a full understanding of what you're going to be doing. This DIY will apply to the Rabbit, the Jetta, the Passat, and mostly to the Beetle. The Beetle is a little bit different, but not different enough to really warrant doing an entire new video. The only real difference you're going to find is that removing the battery tray is a little bit trickier, as well as the room to work is a little bit tighter. The tools that we're going to need for this repair are going to be a ratchet, some extensions, a T30 Torx, a T25 Torx, a 10mm socket, a 12mm socket, a 13mm socket, hose clamp pliers, a torque wrench, a flat blade screwdriver. I like to wear gloves doing this repair, as well as something to clean the oil and debris, and some shop rags. The part that I'm going to be using on this DIY came from shopdap.com, so I'll make sure to put a link in the show notes so you guys can check that out. I've also done a video on exactly how this part fails. I'll put a link in the video notes for you to check that out as well. As far as difficulty level goes, this is really not a hard job. It seems like there's a lot of parts that we're taking off, but it's all really easy stuff to do. You're working in a bit of a tight space while doing that vacuum pump, so again, like always, take your time. And with that, let's get into the DIY. So here we are under the hood of our Jetta, and I'm going to go ahead and start by taking the engine cover off. The first thing I do when I take these engine covers off is go ahead and disconnect the sensors. This one has two. Some of them have only the airflow meter, and some of them don't have any, the ones that are ran off map sensors. So I'm going to take that one off. I'm going to also go ahead and disconnect the airflow meter and set that connector out of the way. I'm going to release the tabs on the air duct here in the front. That'll allow me to pull the air duct out. Then what I do is I take a pry bar and I actually pry up near the mounting point on the engine cover. And that seems to be the best way that I've found to not break the engine cover. I do one on the passenger side front and then one on the passenger side rear. And then if that didn't pop it all the way up, I'll go ahead and do it right on top of the battery, being very careful not to break the battery cover. We'll take the clamp off the boot, pull the boot off. That should allow our engine cover to pretty much come right up. Or not. Okay, now that we have our engine cover off, we're going to actually be working in this area right here. We're also going to need to get the battery out and the tray as well, and the intake boot. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take the intake boot off. I like to slide the clamp down on the hard section here of the boot so that it doesn't crush the accordion portion right here. Take the clamp off the boot at the throttle body. And then we need to take the two secondary air hoses off. And I like to use a flat blade screwdriver for that, being very careful not to break the tabs. If these are being stubborn, hitting them with a little bit of spray lubricant works really well. So now we got those two lines off, we can go ahead and pull the intake boot out of the way and set that to the side. Next up, we're going to go ahead and take the battery out. Take the cover off. Pay attention to how the battery is installed. We want to make sure that all of our cables get routed in the proper direction. And pull the outer cover off. We'll go ahead and disconnect our battery. I like to do the negative side first, but I always loosen them both. Take a flat blade screwdriver, pry the negative cable off, and tuck that to the side, and then pry the positive cable off. Next, we'll go ahead and do the 13mm bolt that holds the battery bracket down. Remove that. And we're going to go ahead and take the battery out of the way. All right, with the battery set to the side, I'm going to go ahead and take the battery tray out, which is just 3 10mm bolts. And you can see there's 1, 2, and then one up here in the front, just in front of the fuse panel. Now we pull the wires out of the way a little bit. There is one wire loom clip down here where the bolt closest to the driver's side is that you may need to pull out of the way. I'm not going to pull it all the way out, but I have had it where I needed to pull it all the way out. I'm going to go ahead and take these 3 bolts out of the way, put those in the magnetic tray, and then lift the battery tray out. We now have the top of the transmission exposed and a little bit more clear picture of where the vacuum pump is. Okay, we're going to be working on the shift selector next. Our vacuum pump is a little bit hidden right here. We're going to get a better view of that with this camera, as well as add a little bit more light to the area that we're going to be working in. Okay, so like I said, we do need to take the shift selector out of the way if we're going to be replacing the vacuum pump this way, or if we're going to be installing the delete kit. If we don't take the shift selector out of the way and disassemble the pump, we're actually going to have to take the transmission loose and separate it from the engine. So this is a way to do this job without having to separate the engine and transmission. Here's a really good shot of the shift selector. I'm not going to disconnect it because sometimes, honestly, it's a pain in the butt to get that connector off. And since I don't have to disconnect it, I'm not going to. What I am going to do is clean up around these two bolts here so that we can mark it to make sure that we get our shift selector perfectly adjusted the way it was before it came out. And once we get a little bit closer to the vacuum pump, we're going to do a better job cleaning this up. I also did not take the belly pan off on this car. I also have the vehicle flat on the ground. You can take the belly pan off to clean up all the oil and residual and dirt and gunk that's caked onto the transmission if you want. It may make it a little bit easier, but since I didn't put the car up in the air, I'm not going to worry about taking the belly pan off. I am, however, going to do a good job cleaning all this oil up. So like I said, we're going to clean this, and we're going to actually mark it so that we get the adjustment points perfectly where they came from. Okay, so we're going to basically put witness marks in red Sharpie right where these bolts are. There is a slight adjustment. This is maybe a little bit overkill. It's just one extra step to make sure that the job goes 100% right. Now, we're going to take the shift selector cable off of the selector. The best way to do that is with like a trim clip tool, but in a pinch you can use a pry bar, and what I like to do is I like to set it underneath and just twist, not really pry on it. And this is simply a ball and cup mount to give you an idea of what that looks like. Again, if it's giving you a little bit of trouble, go ahead and hit it with some lubricant and that should help pop it loose. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that you would need a 12mm socket, and you probably were thinking, Charles, what the heck? Why would we need a 12mm socket when we're working on a Volkswagen? These two bolts on top of the transmission here that hold the shift cable in are 12mm. And we don't have to take that off, but I like to take these off and give yourself a little bit more room to get the shift selector cable out of the way. There's one. There's the other one. And I will take these out of the cable housing and put them right back where they came from. Next, we're going to go ahead and take off this bracket right here that the shift selector cable was attached to. And this nut here is also a 12mm. Get that hose out of the way so you guys can see what I'm doing here. We're going to take this off. Now there is also a washer as well on here that we're going to want to make sure it all goes back in the proper order. And we're going to rock this little bracket off and pull it all up as an assembly. So there's the bracket and the washer and the nut. Now we have just the shift selector. We're going to need to take this nut here loose. There are 3 tabs that hold that in place. We're going to go ahead and just bend the tabs away. There's not a ton of tension on these tabs, so I just take a flat blade screwdriver and open them up just a little bit. You may be able to loosen this nut by hand. If not, I usually take a crescent wrench or something and just crack it loose and then spin it off. We also want to take the little tab with the metal fingers on it off and keep those together as well, or drop them on top of the transmission. Now we're going to go ahead and take those bolts out near where we marked. Those are going to be 10mm bolts. Loosen that one. Loosen that one. Then I'm going to spin these out with my impact gun. There's one. And the other one. Now, unlike the bracket for the shift cable, I'm going to set these in the magnetic tray. We're going to know exactly where they go because they have red marks, just like our shift selector does. Now we're going to go ahead and walk this off of the transmission. Like all the DIYs, I say just take your time. There's no need to rush. We're going to pull this off. You see it all comes off as one assembly, and we're going to set that to the side. Now you'll actually be able to see this bolt here and the other one over here are two of the bolts for our vacuum pump. Now, of course, this is one of those jobs that it's really tricky to see what I'm doing. I have the GoPro down as low as I can get it. Hopefully you guys can see that really crystal clear. Now, I actually like to start by taking the 4 bolts on the cover of the pump off. These are going to be T25s. Now, we're not going to be reusing these bolts, so there's no real need to keep them close by, but I really do like to keep everything out of the engine compartment. Also, before I get all of them off, because we're leaking oil and we're going to probably lose some oil, I'm going to set some shop rags down here so I don't make more of a mess than I really already have on this engine. And I actually like to loosen all 4 of them generally, and then use an electric ratchet to take them the rest of the way out. So we're going to use our snap-on ratchet to take these the rest of the way out. Now with the cover off, this is going to be the key to being able to do this without taking the transmission out of the car. Also, before I take the pump loose of the engine, I like to take the hose off for the brake booster. So I'm going to ease that off. All right, now that we got the line for the brake booster off of the vacuum pump, we're going to go ahead and pull it out of the way. Be very careful with this plastic line. We don't want to crack it and break it. Also, there's a little rubber tab here at the end. We want to make sure that stays in the brake booster pipe. Now, there's really only 4 bolts that we have to take off to get this vacuum pump loose from the engine. One 10mm. I like to use a swivel on this particular 10mm, and then 3 T30s. The 10mm and 1 T30 hold a bracket on for a wire loom. I'll start by taking the 10mm off. It's pretty short, so be careful and don't drop it down in the abyss of the engine. I think I may have said that just one of the T30s and the 10mm hold the bracket on, but it's actually 2 of the T30s and the 10mm hold the bracket on. And we are going to be reusing these T30s, so we want to make sure we hold on to those. Set those in our magnetic tray. There's one at about 10 o'clock. There's one at about 3 o'clock. See, our front cover for our pump has come off, so we're going to go ahead and get that out of the way. The third one is at about 7 o'clock. Now this one's probably the trickiest one to get to. I usually like to come from the front and kind of rock the wrench in. What works even better is if you have a long T30 bit and a bit driver, you can fit that in there very easily. And that's normally what I would use at the shop. So we got that loose. We're going to go ahead and spin this out of the way. This is usually the one that I drop and have to retrieve with a magnet or something. All right. Like I said, that's usually the one I drop, and I did. Okay, now we're ready to go ahead and take the pump out of the car and off the engine. That bracket that we just undid, I like to pull forward and down out of the way. That gives us a little bit more room to get our hand in. We can actually just take the pump and rock it off of the engine. Now, the by-the-book way would be to have the transmission separated, and we would just pull that pump right off and put it back on. But when you take the front cover off, we can actually just move it around that shift selector rod and get the pump out of the car. So we're going to take this, and we're just going to kind of fiddle with it till it flips over and off the engine. Now, as far as cleanup goes, clean it up whenever you feel good. What I don't recommend, though, is cleaning it up with the vacuum pump off of the car. Either do it before you take these parts off or when you're all done. I'm going to just do a little bit of cleanup and clean the surface where the vacuum pump mounts so that we make sure we get a nice, good seal on the pump. You can see all that oil and crud down there. I'm also going to go ahead and retrieve my bolt that I dropped. This repair is actually a really common repair on the 2.5s, and a lot of times we get cars in and people say, hey, I think I got a leaking rear main seal, and you know, on a 2.5 liter, it's almost always going to be this vacuum pump that's leaking, not the rear main seal. Okay, just like when we were taking the old pump off the engine, we had to take the cover off. We're going to have to take the cover off of the new pump as well. We need to be really, really careful when we're doing this so we don't mess up the seal between this cover and the pump housing. We have to be really, really careful when we're taking these bolts out and working and putting this all back together, because we don't want to create another issue that we didn't have before by damaging the seal or damaging the cover. So I like to use my little impact gun. Take the screws out. You can take them out by hand too, there's no problem there. Now we're going to just nice and gently pry the cover off. Notice this seal right here. We need to make sure 100% without fail that this seal right here is installed properly before we put this cover back on. Otherwise, we're going to have an issue. All right, we're ready to put the new pump back in. We need to make sure that this lines up inside the engine, just like the way the old one came off. All right, make sure we have our gasket on, and I'm going to start just like I did before when taking the old pump out. I'm going to have it facing like this. I'm going to rock it over the shift selector and just kind of work it into the hole that it came out of. We need to make sure we're paying attention so that this is all the way flush with the place where the pump housing mounts. And make sure our gasket's installed as well. I always like to start at least one of the bolts, preferably two, so that I can make sure my gasket's properly lined up and my pump's properly lined up before I start putting the cover on, because we really don't want to get any dirt or debris inside this vacuum pump. So I got one bolt started. I'm going to get my bracket. Put my bracket into place. And I'm going to go ahead and start the second one, the one that's at about the 11 o'clock position. All right, so I got two started. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the pump housing cover back on. Again, to make sure that we don't have any debris that'll get inside the pump. Now the pump cover obviously will only go on one way, so it's pretty easy to tell where it goes. Like with a lot of things, I try and start the screws by hand and start all four of them. Now I couldn't find a torque spec for these, so I'm going to tighten them in stages, snugging them up one at a time to make sure that I don't just tighten one and then have this cover kind of twisted and not installed flush and properly. We also made sure that our gasket was properly seated inside that channel in the pump housing. I have had that gasket come out, and it's kind of a pain in the butt to get back in, but just, again, take your time and make sure that it's installed properly. So we're going to go ahead here. Snug it till it touches the face of the cover. You can use power tools on this if you'd like. Just be really careful when you're at the final stages of tightening it. All right, now that they're all snug, I'm going to go back and tighten them. I would guess that this is probably going to be about a 10 Newton meter torque spec. That's just a guess. Again, there is no torque spec for this because technically this pump is not supposed to be disassembled. But as a DIYer, it's really up to you on what you do with these parts. Once you buy them, they're yours. If you want to take the transmission out to replace this pump, by all means, go ahead. Or if you want to do it this way, the considerably easier way, then this is just what we're going to have to do. All right, so those 4 bolts are tight. We are going to go ahead and finish tightening down our vacuum pump. Just like the cover, I like to start all 3 bolts and then tighten them down as well. I do know that the torque spec on these is 10 Newton meters. Just like coming out, that bottom bolt is the trickiest one to make sure that we get it not only in the pump housing, but the bracket for the wire loom as well. I'm going to go ahead and snug these up and get my torque wrench, and we're going to torque these to 10 Newton meters. Actually, before I torque those, I'm going to go ahead and put this 10 millimeter in at the top of the bracket. And remember, we're going to be torquing these to 10 Newton meters. You may struggle a little bit with the bottom one. It's just a matter of getting the tool in the right spot. Okay, our pump is torqued, our cover is on, our bracket is properly installed. We're going to go ahead and pull the yellow cap off the booster. We're going to put the vacuum line onto the booster pump. And now I think it's time to go ahead. I'm going to pull the cameras out of this spot, and I'm going to get all of this nasty oil, grime, and crud cleaned up. Now, it's important to get this as clean as you can, but there's really no reason to go overboard with saturating everything in brake cleaner. I'm going to get as much of this as I can. Plus, my garage is a lot smaller space than the shop is, and I really don't want to be huffing brake clean for like the next 30 minutes while I finish this video up for you guys. Okay, now that we have the bulk of the oil cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and put the shift selector back on, the cable back on, the battery tray in, the battery, the intake boot, as well as the engine cover. We're going to start by going back together with the shift selector. We want it to go right back how it was. We're going to go ahead and set it in and then just ease it on down. And I like to put the 10 millimeter bolts back in it first. That way we can get it all lined up the way it was. We're going to go ahead and get those 10 millimeter bolts tightened down. We want to make sure that our red marks that we made line up with our bolts. So I'm going to snug one and then I'm going to run the other one down and just make sure that we're all lined up before giving them their final tighten. Looks like we're good to go. Go ahead and tighten that down. Okay, our shift selector is installed. Let's go ahead and put our hold down nut. We're going to put the little washer in with the fingers on first. Then we're going to go ahead and twist the nut down. Remember, that wasn't very tight. We didn't even need a tool to take it off, so we're going to put it back on just the same way it came off. Tighten that by hand. You can use pliers or a screwdriver to kind of bend those tabs back onto the nut. I like to do it with just a flat blade screwdriver and kind of push them back onto the nut. You can also use pliers. They don't need to be very tight. They just kind of need to keep the nut from moving. Next, we're going to go ahead and put our shift cable bracket back on. We'll start with the bracket first. Then our washer, then our nut. And if you've done a good job organizing everything, it should be pretty easy to get all this stuff back on. Remember, this is our 12 millimeter nut, so we're going to go ahead and tighten. We're going to go ahead and tighten that down. Don't worry if it changes gears, that's not a problem. We can always just by hand push it back to where it's supposed to go. Next, we're going to put our cable back on. I actually like to put the bracket on first, then snap the cable into the selector. Got one 12 millimeter bolt. I did have to pull the other 12 millimeter bolt out to get the camera mounted properly so you guys can see the R&R of the pump itself. All right, those are ready to be tightened. Go ahead and tighten those down. Careful when you're tightening that one closer to the passenger side. You do need to kind of move the brake booster hose a little bit. Just you don't want to put too much tension on that brake booster hose and break it. All right, those are tight. Next, we want to install the cable onto the selector. So we're going to make sure the selector's in the right spot. And if we need to, we can just put a little bit of lubricant on there. That'll help it snap down a little bit easier. All right, our cable's snapped on. We're plugged in. I have left this connector unplugged before, so make sure that's plugged back in. Do one final quick visual check and make sure that you have everything installed, everything put back, everything tight that needs to be tight. Again, the connector plugged in, the shift selector cable installed. All our bolts are tight, so we're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and put the battery tray in next. Everything from here on out is pretty much reverse of removal. So we got the battery tray set. We're going to start the bolts and get that installed. I'm going to zip those down with my impact. I'm going to put the battery in next. Go ahead and put the bracket for the hold down in. And that's our 13 millimeter bolt. Get our cables on. Now, when you're doing the cable, if you run into an issue where the cable doesn't want to go all the way down on the post, the best thing to do is take a flat blade screwdriver and just pry the cable open a little bit more. And that'll help it go down on the post all the way. You really want to get that down all the way to get as good a connection as possible. We'll go ahead and tighten up the positive side. We're going to put the negative side on as well. Same thing, I'm going to kind of pry it open. That way I can put the cable all the way down on the post. Okay, next we're going to put the intake boot back on. We need to make sure that these two hoses go on all the way and are locked into place. They can go on and look like they're in the right spot, but not be fully clipped in and actually cause the check engine light to come on. So I like to make sure this clamp is properly seated, then I'll do the two secondary air pipes. And I always like to snap them in and then give them a little tug just to make sure that they're snapped in all the way. By the way, if you guys don't have a pair of these locking hose clamp pliers, I highly recommend them. They're super awesome. Because now we can just leave this hose clamp held and we don't have to worry about fiddling with it with the engine cover on. Okay, with all the tools out of the way, it's time to go ahead and put the engine cover back on. I like to put a little bit of lubricant on these rubber grommets. That'll make it come off easier next time, as well as go on easier this time. You know, I have mixed feelings about some of the things that Volkswagen does. This engine cover right here is one that I am not a huge fan of. All right, we got our engine cover on. We're going to put our boot on all the way. We're going to grab our airflow meter connector from back here, plug that in, plug in our intake air temp sensor connector, get that locked in the channel. When I dropped that bolt, I actually found the duct cover, so I'm going to put that back on. I'm going to get the rest of our battery tray. We're going to install that. And the cover. So now that we got everything back together, I'm going to clean up the rest of the tools, take it on a quick drive, check for leaks, and come back and wrap it up. So there you have it, one full complete DIY of a 2.5 vacuum pump. Including the time to shoot the video, it took me about an hour to do this repair. I would leave at least 2 to 2.5 hours to do this repair if it's the first time you've done one. There's a couple of bolts that are a little bit tricky and you have to really get the angle right, especially that bottom T30 on the pump. Also, make sure that we test drive the vehicle and recheck for any oil leaks, as well as set the pinch protection on the windows and set the clock because we had the battery out. All right guys, I'm gonna wrap it up. If you have any questions or comments, post it in the comment section below. Hey, if you like the video, throw it a thumbs up on YouTube. I always appreciate that. You can also subscribe on YouTube or on the blog at humblemechanic.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the blog, and obviously here on YouTube. All right guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.